So I would encourage you to find a comfortable seat, something that will allow you to come fully present into this moment and into this space right now together. You might close your eyes if that facilitates your inward movement. And if not, you can find a soft gaze on the floor or the table in front of you. And let's just have a few moments of silence to start us off. Slowly blooms the rose within. 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 Amen. Our talk today is called A Long, Loving Look at the Real. And We're going to get into some discussion about contemplation and how that relates to our craft, which is, of course, what we've been talking about for 2 days now, but we'll talk about it from another angle today. And I love that chant. The words, if you didn't catch them, were "slowly blooms the rose within." It's a reference to a Hafiz poem that I can't quote from memory, nor do I have it written down in front of me. But it's something to the effect of how did the rose let go of its fear in order to bloom? And the answer is the same as any being. It felt the encouragement of light against its body. Or the encouragement of the sun against its body, something like that. And I find that to be the perfect image for the contemplative life, the faithful life, is slowly in the sunshine, in the light of God's love for us, we slowly, slowly, slowly unwind and allow ourselves to blossom. So that's a wonderful chant for that kind of thing. The definition of contemplation that I work with and that I use in retreats and writing and that sort of thing is that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. And that may be different from some of the definitions of contemplation that you have encountered before. It's certainly different from the way that a lot of folks talk about contemplation. Notice I didn't say contemplation is meditation or prayer or staring at your navel or anything like that. Though it might involve some of those things. It might involve prayer, it might involve meditation, but contemplation is really something that's much larger than a particular practice. Contemplation is a way of being. It's a stance toward the world and toward ourselves as a part of the world. So again, the definition that I use is contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. So let's break that down a little bit. The first piece of that is that it is the long piece. Contemplation is long. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that, I snap my fingers and, oh, now I'm in contemplation. It's a process that we enter into that takes a long time. Slowly blooms the rose within, that it's a slow process, and it's a process of slowing down as well. So that in the course of the life of faith, it's usually not until the end of one's life. I mean, we have different examples of this, of course, but it's usually in the old that we see the real flowering of contemplation. And it's not that old people have suddenly, bam, entered into contemplation, but over the course of a lifetime of faithful engagement, they find themselves flowering, often at the very end of life. And I like to think about this sometimes. You may be familiar with the Celtic notion of thin places. They are places in the world that have been rubbed thin through prayer so that the veil between this world and the heavenly world is thin, and you can see through it more easily, move back and forth more easily. Well, I like to think that there are thin people in that sense. And you may have known some of them, and they are usually old. People who have been worn smooth through the life of prayer, the life of faithful engagement, so that you can see God shining out of their face in a way that for most of us is a little more obscured because we have a lot of other stuff going on too. So contemplation is a long process, a lifelong process. And in that sense, it's really an antidote to the quick fix of certainly American culture, and wanting to kind of have our instant gratification. Contemplation is not going to be like that. It's not going to happen quickly. It's not going to be a straight line from point A to point B. It's a gradual, slow deepening and softening. Another image that really helps me with that process is that I like to think back to when I first really got engaged in a serious way with my spiritual life, sort of out of college. And when I look back on those days, I used my spiritual practices like a jackhammer. Like I was going to break away all of the sharp edges through force of will. And one of the things that life teaches us as we get older is that force of will isn't going to do it. You know, you cannot will yourself into softness, into healing, into wholeness. Life throws all kinds of things at us that we would never want or anticipate, and your force of will can't get you through it. Which is not to say that there's not a place for strong strength and will and perseverance, but it's not going to soften you. Instead, now I like to think of the spiritual life as a gentle water that's lapping at the shore. And over thousands of years, it will change the shape of the shoreline. The rocks will get soft and smooth so that you can skip them over the water. But that's very different from a jackhammer that's going to break down the hard edges of a life. And really that jackhammer image is a really a violent image. And Lord knows we don't need any more violence in our world. Our world is violent enough. So contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. If it's long, it's also loving. And through the course of engaging in contemplation over a whole lifetime, we learn to see through the eyes of love. Actually, I'm finding that I'm wanting to stop and move to the gaze part and come back to the love part. So I'm going to follow my intuition on that one. We'll come back to the love piece and the eyes of love, but it's a long, loving look at the real. So contemplation involves looking. It involves gazing. And there's this story of this old woman sitting in church and just sitting there and staring ahead of her in this empty church. And the priest comes into the church and he sits down next to her and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Oh, I'm sitting here and looking at God." And the priest says, "And what is God doing?" And she says, "God's sitting here and looking at me." We can make contemplation very, very complex, but it's really that simple. It's really about sitting and looking and being looked at. So contemplation is both about seeing and about being seen, right? And in the paradoxical way of all of these things of God, in seeing, I am seen, right? So through contemplation, I both gaze on God and I am gazed on by God. God gazes on me. So contemplation allows us to move into a mutuality. And notice that's not a head thing. That's really a heart thing, right? The Cloud of Unknowing, that 14th century English mystical text, says something to the effect of, we can never know God, who is all-powerful and pervades everything, but we can actually love God. And through love, we can possess all of God and allow God to possess all of us. So the power of the heart, the power of love, far transcends what our minds are able to comprehend. Because the mind is really, is a center of knowing, of course. The mind is a center of knowing, but it's the center of knowing that sees difference, that distinguishes this is not this, right? There's left and there's right. The heart is also a center of knowing, but it's the center of knowing that sees in harmony, that sees that left is right and right is left. So of course we need both of those faculties. You need to know that left is not right, so that when you get to the turn you need to make at the bottom of the street, you know which way to go to get to the grocery store. But we also need to be able to see through the eyes of the heart, to see in harmony, to see that I am in you and you are in me and we are together in God. So we need both kinds of seeing, but contemplative sight is really the sight that's centered in that heart way of seeing harmony and unity. Not opposed to the head, including that, but centered in the heart. So if contemplation is a long, loving look at the real, then what we are gazing at and what is gazing upon us is the real with a capital R, right? It is not a fantasy. It's not, God is not who I wish God to be. You know, at a certain point, we have to let go of that fantasy God. What I called the vending machine God. You know, I put the quarter in, I press the button, I'm going to get the result that I want. And I can remember when I first started discernment toward the priesthood, I went to see the rector of the church that I went to. This was back in college. And he said, okay, well, first tell me about your prayer life. And I looked at him and I said, what's that? Because my only understanding of prayer at that point in my life was the kind of prayer that I asked God for stuff. And my experience was that I could ask God for stuff all day long and God wasn't going to give me the stuff that I asked for. So what was the point in doing that? And a part of our maturing process in the life of prayer and the life of faith is to come to understand that that isn't how God works. That isn't who God is. That does not mean that prayer is not answered, but it means that God is not a vending machine where you put in a quarter, you press the button, you get your Cheetos, and you know everybody's happy. So that's not how God works. And at a certain point, actually at many points along the way, because it doesn't just happen one time, God invites us, encourages us, sometimes demands that we let go of the idols we have been worshiping in place of God. And again, that happens all the time, that we run into the wall and we find out, oh, I have been worshiping an idol rather than God, who is profoundly mysterious. And whenever we feel super comfortable and settled in our idea of who God is, that's probably when God's going to pull the rug out from under us and say, well, it's not that I'm not that, but I'm also all these other things too, right? So if that's true in the relationship with God, it's true in all of our relationships. You know, anyone who is married or who has been married or been in an intimate relationship will know that there comes a point in the relationship when your fantasy of who this person was slips away and you realize, like, you know, they're not who I thought they were. That can be a crisis moment. It is a crisis moment in any relationship. And the invitation there is to move into a relationship with a real person who's not a projection of my fantasies, but to actually a real person who is other from me, right? So that happens and has to happen in our life with God, and it happens all the time. And I had a spiritual director who used to ask, "Are you praying dangerously?" He would say, "Are you praying to have God remove or relieve you of your obsessions and your fantasies, your obsessions and your illusions?" And most of us don't pray that way. Most of us, and I include myself in this, most of us, most of the time, are very comfortable with our obsessions and our illusions, and we're not really interested in having those taken away. But at a certain point, for us to mature and to grow, they need to be taken away. And the truth is, they'll need to be taken away again and again over the course of our life, because they can be taken away today, and in a couple years' time, I've built up some new obsessions and illusions, and those will have to be taken away as well. And hopefully I'm not as attached to them next time as I have been this time, and so on and so forth. Right, so contemplation is built upon a relationship with reality, with capital R reality. And that is the reality of the world that we live in. It's the reality of who we ourselves are, of the lives we have lived, and in the lives that we haven't lived. Because of course you have to make choices in your life, and every choice you say yes to, you've said no to something else. And so, how do you make peace with the reality that here's a life that I chose not to live? That's a part of it as well. And of course, reality is not just the bad things that have happened to us or have happened in our world, but reality is the beauty of the world. Reality is the heartbreaking beauty that surrounds us. And really, that's what the engagement with reality that is contemplation will show us, is that the beautiful and the heartbreaking, the joyful and the sorrowful are really part of the same reality. And the sorrow lends depth and beauty to joy, just as joy softens sorrow so that we can endure it. And no life is all one or all the other. They're woven together. So to backtrack a little bit, and this is why I wanted to come back around to the love piece, is that contemplation ultimately moves us deeper into love, right? So you could have any kind of gaze you can imagine, or long look at the real, right? You could look at the real and you could be really angry about it. You could look at the real, you could be really sad about it. You could be really happy about it. You could be whatever, right? But through the process of contemplation, we actually come to love reality, right? We come to love both the heartbreak and the joy, right? When we can see that they are part of the same thing, part of the same movement, then we've actually entered into real, deep, abiding love. So I had somebody ask me the other day, planning a retreat for a parish group in the fall, and this committee wants to talk about the mystics, and one of them said, for instance, like, how can you say that all shall be well? Look at the world around us right now, right? But through the eyes of love, we can say that not only will all be well at some point in the future, but in the eternal now that we're in, everything is already fundamentally well. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that need to be changed, right? That's not what I'm suggesting here. But it does mean that seen through the eyes of love, God is already working out God's plan of salvation, as the traditional language would put it. And this is what the monastic tradition calls holy indifference. Or apatheia, which is the Latin term for it. Holy indifference is the trust that whatever things look like on the surface, God is at work. God, that these are, in the language of the scriptures, the birth pangs of the new creation, right? And I've been reflecting recently for a sermon that I'm putting together for next week. The phrase keeps coming to me, where there's death, there's hope, right? Because I certainly hope that the world we live in today is not the world we're living in next year, 10 years from now, 100 years from now. The cycle of death and rebirth, of course, is at the heart of Christian spirituality, right? So seen through the eyes of love, we see that death is not final, that death is necessary, death is good, that there is hope within that, right? But it's not just that through contemplation we see with the eyes of love, but actually we are seen with the eyes of love. And perhaps we can come to see ourselves through the eyes of love. In being gazed upon, in entering it even partially into God's gaze upon us, we can come to see ourselves in a different light as well. And you know, most people think that, and I fall into this category too, most of us think that we have to work really hard to become good. And what we don't realize is that we're already good enough, that we're never going to be good in the sense of perfect, without flaws, without hurts, without pain, without any of those kind of things. But that God is already as fully in love with us as it's possible to be. It's we who need to get on board with that. It's not that God needs to be brought on board with that. So, you know, all of this seen through the eyes of love is seeing the harmony, seeing that all is fundamentally already well. And again, that's not to say that there isn't pain, that there isn't injustice, that there isn't oppression, and that it's not our place to work for a better world, because it is. But when we can see that we're already as deeply loved as we can be, then we're able to work for a better world from a different foundation. So let me bring this back around to craft. How does craft help us to enter into this movement of contemplation, into this long, loving look at the real? Well, I think one of the most fundamental ways that craft moves us into contemplation is through the encounter with beauty. And we've touched on this just a little bit in some of the reflection time after, I think it was the first meeting 2 days ago. But the encounter with beauty is a deeply, how do I want to put it? The encounter with beauty is the encounter with goodness itself. And I come back to this phrase that a friend of mine used to use. You know, he was very quick to fall in love with the next person that he was dating. And he would say, they convey me to myself. And, you know, he was a little melodramatic, of course, because this happened all the time. But I love that phrase of being conveyed to oneself. That is what happens in the encounter with beauty. We are taken outside of ourselves, right? Just think of the most, just right now, take a moment and think of the most beautiful thing that you have seen recently. Something small or something large. And what happened in that moment? The way that I make sense of what happens in those kind of moments when you know, the slant of light through the trees makes this beautiful pattern on the ground, or, you know, a sunset, or beautiful rose on the rose bush, or the face of someone you really love. What happens is that we kind of like stop for a moment and catch our breath, and we realize that like we had been going through the day almost on autopilot, and all of a sudden, like the world has changed, even briefly, even just for that moment. I think in the encounter with beauty, we lose our self-consciousness, right? By which I mean that we stop thinking of ourselves and we're focused in on something that is totally other than we are. And yet, in that otherness, we find that there is a mutuality, a mutual indwelling, right? So when you're gazing at a beautiful painting in a museum or in your home or a friend's home or something, you know, sitting there and just staring at that beautiful thing, you're taken outside of yourself, and you're also simultaneously brought more deeply into yourself. That's what happens in the encounter with beauty. Most of us craft these days, not for utility, but for the sake of beauty, right? Even if our finished objects are not going to hang on museum walls, even if they're not to anybody else's taste, right? I'm not talking about taste here. Most of us craft because, at least in large part, so that we can make something that is beautiful, so that we can spend time with a beautiful object, both in the making of it and then afterwards as well. For me, that's the story of the quilt I have behind me today. The colors don't come out as well on this screen, but this quilt is something I made with all out of William Morris fabrics, and I made it because I love William Morris fabric. I think it's so beautiful. And I put together the quilt, and everyone I have shown it to has said, oh, that's not really to my taste. It's too busy. There's too much going on there. And I can see from a formal artistic point of view what they mean. And I don't care, because I think it is beautiful. I love the fabrics in it. I love looking at them. I love tracing the patterns in them. I loved every minute of cutting them out and putting them together, because I got to be surrounded by these really beautiful colors and patterns. And at the end of the day, I always knew it was a quilt for me. It's not a quilt for other people. So I'm not talking about taste here, but I'm talking about the power of beauty to bring us into a deeper harmony, and really just into joy and pleasure, you know? So I think one of the things that's important to point out about beauty, to bring it into the spiritual and the theological context, you know, in the story of creation, in Genesis, it goes, God created the heavens and the earth, and it was very good, right? God said that it was good, it was very good. The word good is used over and over again. And of course, that happens again in the New Testament as well, when you talk about Jesus, the good shepherd, right? And in both instances, the word that we translate as good can also be translated as beautiful, right? God created the heavens and the earth and called them beautiful, and they were very beautiful. Jesus said, I am the beautiful shepherd. And what I take from that is this sense that beauty, true deep beauty, as opposed to glamour, I'm not talking about glamour, but true deep beauty is good, is inherently good. And being in relationship with beauty draws us into relationship with the good. When we can see the beautiful in ourselves, we see that we are good enough. And when we can see the beauty in another person, it's similar. And so that's the power of beauty, to really draw us into the heart of God and to see ourselves and our world in a different way. In the encounter with beauty, we both see and we are seen at a deeper level. I have a poem to share on this, this subject. Let me see if I can find it here. And I'm going to end with this poem as a kind of closing prayer for us. Although knowing me, I'll probably talk for a few more minutes after I read it. But so this is from Rilke, and it's called Archaic Torso of Apollo. It's in the essay that I've put on the website for you. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit. And yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. That is the power of the encounter with beauty, the encounter that our craft can take us more deeply into. That these seemingly inanimate objects, through a loving gaze, can actually see us again. And in entering into that mutuality, we realize that we have to change our lives. That makes it seem like this big dramatic thing, because it can be a small thing as well. Maybe what we see is that our lives are already changed simply in the act of being gazed upon and in gazing. That in that mutuality, already something has shifted, something is different. That is the promise and the invitation of entering into craft as contemplation. And that's my prayer for you, for me, for all of our world, is that we would learn to see with loving eyes the beauty that is all around and within us. It's been a pleasure to be on retreat with you these 3 sessions, and I wish you all the best.